Quick note for the kids, don't have anything for you today, but next week we're going to bless your backpacks for school. So if you would remember to bring your backpacks with you to Mass, we're going to bless them, and we have something for your backpack, which I think is really cool. So make sure you remember to bring those next week. We're looking forward to having you talk to you a little bit then. But for the adults, a topic that suits us a little better. The man in this story who calls out to Jesus, he can teach us something, but you kind of have to be a little brave to go for it. We don't know much about this guy. Basically, there's no background given, just this statement that he makes. Tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. But in that, there's a lot you can pick up. First of all, there's clearly a dispute over the inheritance. Now, we don't know what that would be. Inheritance in Jesus' day, a little different than our own. Just for example, one real likely possibility here is that, as was the custom, all the inheritance in the family went to the older son. And this guy may have been a younger brother. And so he's just trying to get this guy, all the inheritance belongs to his older brother. He's just trying to get him to share some of it. That's a possibility. Also a possibility that there is some dispute, some legitimate dispute that this guy deserves part of the inheritance. We're not real sure. But whatever's going on, it's important to this guy. You can tell. It's not as quite clear in this translation, but in other translations, the way the writers put it, you get the distinct impression that Jesus is not, if you will, in the front row having a conversation with Jesus. Jesus would most likely be sitting. That was how you taught in that day. The teacher sat, everyone else stood. And so you get this impression from some of the other translations that this guy's in the back. He's far away, and he calls out. It says, hey, Jesus, tell my brother. And so it's important for him that he is willing to interrupt what's going on. And, of course, he's showing the importance of this issue because he's willing to bring it up in public. Rather than keeping it as a family dispute, he's willing to tell everybody. And assuming that his older brother is really at fault, he's pretty much throwing his big brother under the bus in front of everybody. This matters to this guy. This is important to him. I find it interesting what Jesus does. First, Jesus dismisses the whole idea that he is going to judge this. I can't be sure, but I get the impression that what Jesus wants to do here is not like, no, you need to go find somebody else to be the judge. I think Jesus is saying to him, you ought to work this out yourself. This is not something you need a judge or an arbiter. This is a question between brothers. Go figure it out. But more importantly is Jesus' next line, which he makes not to the guy, but to everybody that's there. He says, beware of all greed. Or other translations will say, beware of all forms of greed. Because if you think about it, there is potentially a lot of greed in this little story. If the older brother has all the inheritance, quite rightfully, but he's holding on to it, won't share any with the younger brother, that's certainly greed. If this guy who's calling out, maybe he does deserve some of it, but the way he's going about it would certainly mean that this money matters to him, and there's some greed in that. And indeed, there's even greed in what he's doing, because Jesus is teaching. And maybe Jesus has gotten to the topic of sharing or love of your enemy or something like that, and this guy thinks, oh, I got a perfect example for you, Jesus, and calls out. But even in that case, he is still interrupting Jesus' teaching. He's being greedy about Jesus' time. Like, my issue is way more important, Jesus, than anything else you happen to be talking about. My issue is way more important than anything else anybody else is thinking about. He's being greedy that way. There's a lot of greed going around here. And Jesus takes that moment to say, you guys need to be careful about this. And see, this is where it gets challenging, because are you willing to have Jesus say that line to yourself and to me? Hear Jesus say, hey, you guys need to be careful here. You need to beware of all forms of greed. Now, if you are like most people, this is easy, right? Because you say, I'm not greedy. And why do you say that? Well, you say that because you're thinking of the guy in the parable who is clearly greedy. He's thinking only of himself, he's got this wonderful harvest, and he thinks only of himself. He never once in that parable thinks or says anything about anybody else. That's greed. Or you might be thinking of Ebenezer Scrooge, or the kids could be thinking of, what Scrooge McDuck, diving into his vault of money and swimming around. And you say, I'm not like that. I don't have a lot of money, and I don't lie, cheat, and steal to get more money. I'm not greedy. You see, Jesus is like, beware of all forms of greed. Because I would suggest to you that maybe not you, hope not, but a lot of Americans are very greedy when it comes to elections. Many of you have been alive long enough. You've been through lots and lots and lots of elections. And, the people that track this kind of stuff, what will they tell you about typically the number one motivating factor for people when they vote and how they vote? Economics. They tell you that we as Americans vote our pocketbook. That's what they'll tell us. Well, is there not potentially a little bit of greed in that? I'm going to choose elected officials based on how it's going to turn out for me in my pocketbook. Mind you, I could vote economically by thinking about other people. I could say, I'll support this candidate because they have policies that would be helpful to this group of people, not myself. You could do that. That would be interesting, I think. But evidently, we don't do that. Or take the current gun debate. Have you noticed that so much about the gun debate? The word "my" is the prominent word in it. It's my gun. It's mine. It reminds me of the guy in the story. Father Brad looked this up, counted this. I was impressed. Jesus' story has 63 words in it. 12 of them is this guy talking about himself, using personal pronouns for himself. As Jesus tells this story and the guy's thinking and talking, he only talks about himself. Well, if you're in the midst of the gun debate, and it's a fair debate, you can have a wonderful, highly interesting, highly helpful debate on both sides of that. But you got to be careful that it doesn't sneak into greed. Oh, my position about this is just because of what I want, without doing what Catholic social teaching would teach us, which is I need to be concerned when I'm thinking about these kind of important issues about the common good. Those are different things. You might, in thinking it out, I don't know how you have thought about this, but perhaps you end up someplace different. Or to take something different, what about greed in conversations? Well, some of you know that I did all that hiking and climbing when I was in seminary with my seminary buddy, with Brian, and those were typically on Thursdays on our day off, and then Friday. It was not uncommon for people to talk to us, ask us, where'd you go, tell us a story, and of course, that kind of stuff. You always had a story to tell. And sometimes, often actually, we'd be sitting around a dinner table with other guys from the seminary, and we'd be talking. And one of the guys would say, that's dangerous. You guys shouldn't do that. Now, it's entirely possible that those comments were made out of genuine concern for our safety, because there was some risk involved in what we were doing. But more often, the way it was said, when it was said, the timing, all that kind of stuff, I sensed a little bit of greed in it. because they were greedy for the attention of the table. They didn't want to talk about stuff that only concerned Brian and I. They wanted to talk about stuff that concerned them. And so they made that comment in just a very greedy kind of little way to sort of get the attention back to something that they thought would be better for them. And if you allow me, I mean, I'm already on ground where I'm making some people uncomfortable. I might as well go all the way. Perhaps you could ask, why did you buy the last lotto ticket you bought? I mean, I know it was only $1, $2, I don't know what it is anymore. But you have to ask, why did I do that? Why did I buy that? And that's the question, why? Now, I know some people, I've heard people, they have sort of covered over, I think, their real reason for buying the ticket by telling me what they intend to do with the money. How they're going to be so generous with it, and they're going to give, oh yes, Father, we'll give money to the church, you know, that kind of stuff. I'm going to buy stuff for the family, it'll be wonderful, and they do this, but I am always left with the distinct impression that that is not the real reason why they bought that ticket. And I don't know, I mean, I suspect you could buy the ticket for sheer fun. You know, maybe you just kind of fun to buy it and pick random numbers and see what comes up. That's possible, but I think it's worth asking. Am I buying this because I want a lot of money? And like, I have every intention of, yeah, I'll give some of it away, but most of that money is going to be mine. I mean, is that in me? No, it is a difficult topic. Because I find it in myself. A few years ago, I noticed it when I was able to write, if you will, slightly larger checks to charity. You know, I remember the first time I wrote a check and there was a comma in it to some charity. And I don't know, there was just something about it. It was like, $1,000? $1,000? Like, there was a part of me that just kind of repelled at this. Like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You know, maybe 500 is plenty. This is in me. I know it's in me. I mean, I've been wrestling with this all week. I can see this in subtle little ways, not only in money, but in other things. I hear Jesus all week saying to me, beware, be careful of all forms of greed. And so I offer that to you as well, but with two final things it's important to keep in mind. Please remember, Jesus doesn't tell us this to make us feel bad, to give us yet one more thing we have to struggle with. None of that. Jesus tells us this because he knows this is good for us. Greed is a terrible thing. Anytime you run across it, who likes it? Who thinks it is good to be greedy? We all know it's bad for us and for other people. This is just good. This is just Jesus trying to love us and be helpful to us. He's just saying, oh, please, be careful about this. And so Jesus is telling this out of love. But even more importantly, Jesus isn't saying, okay, you go take care of this, go fix this, make sure, don't come back until you get it fixed. In other words, Jesus isn't leaving it just to us. We don't have to do this out of our own strength. The old expression, I got to pull myself up by my own bootstraps kind of thing. That's not the way our faith works. Good Lord wants to help us. The Holy Spirit will help us. We just have to ask. We just have to take the initiative to say, okay, Jesus, you warned me about this, and maybe I need to pay attention to this. And so then we open our hearts. The psalm. If today you hear God's voice, harden not your heart. We open up our hearts to God and say, okay, I think I need some help here. And the good Lord will help us. He will, help us do a little better. Maybe just be aware of it. Maybe to help us move a little bit farther along. Help us to not have these subtle instances of greed in our lives. Help us to draw closer to him and to one another.